We assume, oh, there's a disease or an insect, but that's kind of the last thing, right? There's a lot of other things that we troubleshoot before that, and I would say insect or disease is only about, insects maybe 50% of the time your problem, disease about 10% of the time. So it's not very common. So first thing we want to think about is the idea of how a plant actually works. And we always think of it in terms of the shoot system, everything that's above ground, because we can see it, right? But we also need to keep in mind our root system as well. And commonly we think of just, okay, we know plants need sun, we know plants need water, but if there's a problem underground, it can be harder to diagnose what's happening. So you want to be sure that you educate yourself on all of that stuff, right? That's important, everything that's happening in your soil. So I'm going to go through, she was kind enough to print my slides out just so I have kind of a checklist. So the things that we are going to start with today with troubleshooting are sun, water, soil, planting time, and then other issues. These are most of the time going to be the problems that are occurring in your vegetable garden. So first one is sun. Anyone know what is considered full sun? Most vegetables are full sun. Does anyone know, that kind of, I don't want to say definition, 8 hours, at least 8 hours, okay? So if your plant is not getting 8 hours of sunlight, and I see this often with people who have shady gardens, it's not going to thrive. It'll grow, probably, but you're not going to get a big, beautiful, bushy tomato plant if it doesn't have access to sun. Here in Oklahoma, I also then get the question, is there such a thing as too much sun? I think, or I get, my tomatoes are getting too much sun and they're dying. They're burning up and they're dying. Rarely, okay? Most of the time it's a temperature issue, right? Because I don't know if you notice, but sometimes it gets really hot here. It's like living on the surface of the sun. And your tomato plant feels the same way. It doesn't have anything to do with the sunlight per se, in that the UV rays are too much for it. It's just the heat. So oftentimes if you'll have a high tunnel like this, you'll see shade cloth. Shade cloth is a way to remedy that and to help your plants so that they get a little bit of relief, just like us, right? Sitting in the shade right now and wanting to come back in the shade when we go out in the garden here in a little while. So that's the first thing you want to keep in mind. Only exception, and we can talk about this today when we're out pruning up some tomatoes, the only exception is if you go out and prune the heck out of a tomato plant and all of a sudden the foliage that's in the very center or the fruit that's been covered up in leaves is exposed to the sun, you can get the equivalent of a sunburn. You can get a scald on it. Same thing with us, right? If you, well, I was going to use myself as an example. If I go to the pool, my arms and legs are in the sun so much, but if I go to the pool, my shoulders are exposed or my stomach is exposed, that's going to burn way faster. Same idea, right? Well, and if you have skin the color of me, you put on a bunch of sunblock anyway. Okay. But the plant has the capacity to amp itself up and protect itself from the sun, but it takes some time. It's part of the hardening off process, right? When we move our plants from a cozy greenhouse to outside, that's part of it too. So the second thing we're going to talk about is water. Water is a big thing for your root system. We know this, right? A plant dies if it gets too little water. That's pretty obvious. It is possible to have too much water if your garden does not get good drainage. And so that's a problem that I often see with people who have low areas and try to garden. So it becomes a swimming pool. And if your roots are down in the water, while your plant does transpire, it does have the capabilities to let off some excess moisture. It will essentially drown it. So you want to be sure, and you have our nice hilled up rows here. It's a great way to make sure that you have good drainage. Because if we have a swamp between the rows, your root system still has the capabilities of being slightly above. Okay? Next thing is soil, and soil is a tough one because soil problems can present in a lot of different ways. And oftentimes if you have, say, one nutrient deficiency, you might have a multi-nutrient deficiency, which means that it's really hard to target exactly what's going on without a soil test. Soil tests are very, very important, and that's something that you really should do in your garden and then continue to do every couple years. My garden at my house, I live right in Tulsa, so we've just got raised beds. So every year I'll take 2 or 3 samples in from 2 or 3 raised beds, and then I don't have to pay for all of them all at once. But every one of them is a little bit different. Different parts of your garden can be a little bit different. If you get a lot of water runoff from one part, it can be different than somewhere that holds water. So we need to think about that as well. That can present in a lot of ways. It's more than just yellowing of the leaves. You can get sometimes almost a purpley color, the veins turn a different color. If you have multiple plant families, so say you're out and you're looking at your tomatoes and you're looking at your okra and they both aren't doing well, they're in different plant families, so it's probably not a disease. It's probably a soil problem. And I'll see this a lot with homeowners' gardens, where they'll go out and just nothing is really growing or everything is turning yellow. That is almost exclusively a soil problem. So if it's across all plant families in your garden, you want to check that out. And then the last thing that we'll talk about is plant time. Well, a couple last things. Planting timing. If we went out today and tried to put brand new peas in the ground, they wouldn't grow because it's way too hot. They don't like certain soil temperatures and they don't like certain ambient air temperatures. So we're not just saying it's above ground. Soil temperature affects how your plants will grow too. So when you have a handy list, and all of our extension services have great lists of when to plant in Oklahoma, very, very helpful. Because that way, if you're not familiar with what a cool season vegetable is or what a warm season is, that'll give you a resource to say, okay, so if we're planting a row today and it's really hot out, what can we plant in the garden? How can we use space with something that's going to be happy out there? Do we plant from seed? Do we get a transplant? You want to be sure that you have enough time to grow, right? If you put something out there that takes 200 days today, it's going to be winter. So your timing is going to be very important. And I get that a lot this time of year with tomatoes. Well, my tomato plant isn't doing anything. The fruit's been green. Well, it's too hot now. So your tomatoes are kind of taking a break. So plant timing is going to be a big thing too. And then the last thing we're going to talk about, and get to my miscellaneous issues here, are just all of the different random things that can go wrong. So your last couple checks. First one is that I'll talk about is pesticide drift. Has anyone ever had that happen to them out here? I have a home gardener in Tulsa she has one of those neighbors who really likes the lawn. Like he's a lawn guy, and he sprays stuff on that lawn constantly. And it goes through her chain link fence and it kills her vegetable garden. And he's also that nice guy that she's talked to about it. And he's like, but my lawn is really important, right? And the lawn. Like, who sold us on that? So anyway.
We had a little of that with poppy seed next door.
Yeah.
Yes.
It's a very real thing. And it's worth checking in with your neighbors too and telling them or talking to them, when do you spray? What do you spray? What can I do to make sure that I'm not spraying anything around your space? It's not uncommon, right? So it's one of those things. It's worth talking to your neighbors.
And if it can't be mitigated, you can call the Natural Resource Conservation Service at your local service centers, and they have a specialist that will come out to see, to kind of act as a mediator to see how they can help to mitigate the problem if the neighbor is not cooperating, because there may have to be a barrier built of some sort, or even the Corps of Engineers may have to get involved. When they put in the drain down here, they did not think that there was going to be, water coming from there down here into our pond. But that's exactly what is happening. And we have one other participant who has a neighbor, and there is a pond that separates them, and he's chemical heavy.
Mm-hmm. Yep. And I will say that particular client of mine mitigated it by getting the brightest, orangest tarp she could find and affixing it to the fence between their yards. I don't recommend being passive aggressive, but talking to your neighbors, usually people are generally want to be very respectable, especially if you're feeding your family the food from the garden. Most of us really want to keep that in mind and be kind. So the next one is that you picked a plant that doesn't grow well here. We can grow most things, but there are a few plants that just aren't real happy here. I have celery growing in my garden right now, and it's making it, like it's hanging in there. It's not real happy, and it doesn't taste good. It's really bitter, but we put it in smoothies. We don't care. But if you're wanting to have a market farm, you don't want crummy, bitter celery, right? It doesn't do very well here. You can work with it in a high tunnel situation, but this is not its favorite climate to grow in. Same thing, there are certain tropical plants, you don't plant a lemon tree Not going to work here unless you have a greenhouse like Martha Stewart has in Maine. I don't know if you ever want to see something that costs a lot of money. She has like a 2-story citrus high tunnel thing. Because, you know, why not, right? What else is she going to do with her money? But so make sure that you're picking and picking a variety that works well here too. I love a good heirloom tomato, but a lot of mine are early girls because it just works better with our seasons oftentimes. They set fruit early, then during the hottest part of the season, they do wind down a little bit. But if you're wanting those huge, big, beautiful Cherokee purple tomatoes, they definitely grow here, but you're not going to expect as much of a harvest. So it just depends on your priorities. I usually do kind of a mix of both, so that way you're getting enough plants to get the best of both worlds. Okay. Next is environmental stress. And last year, I know for those of you who have come and we've talked about this, last year the sun just absolutely tried to murder us, right? The summer is so much more mild, and we were having those days on end of heat upon heat upon heat. It was hot at night, so plants weren't even getting relief then. We weren't getting any relief then. We have no control over that. We have no control over hail. We have no control over wind. So there's going to be some environmental stress that you just have to assume will happen, and you do the best you can. We got our, hurricane windstorm that surprised us a couple weeks ago. A lot of people and farmers with tall plants had to go back out, restake, replant. So some of that stuff is to be expected, so plan for it. The easiest thing to do is just accept that you will have some loss during the season, plant crops and with enough diversity that some won't be affected by heat or drought, right? Next thing is pollination issues. This isn't something that you all should have much of an issue with. I put it in here because if I have clients that are in new planned communities, oftentimes that means that everything the grassland has been annihilated, right? It's gone. And then they're building a new subdivision, so nobody has ornamental plants in yet. And so that means that no bees are coming through. This is going to be an issue if you have cucurbits, so squash family cucumbers. You'll notice that you won't get much pollination. Fortunately out here, shouldn't be a problem. We have enough biodiversity in this area, but it is something to keep in mind. There are parts of Texas apparently that don't get bees. I don't know why you'd want to live somewhere where a bee doesn't want to live, but it can be a real problem, and especially if you are heavy on crops that require those insects.
Some of your southern areas spray for mosquitoes, and that takes out the bees. Yeah, the mosquito spraying's gotta stop. I mean, I hate them too, but it's terrible. Yeah. It wipes out a lot, and food for your bats too. Yeah. It really affects our ecosystem. Next one, and this is real common, that people, they go to the garden center and they think to themselves, okay, so that the tomatoes are this big. Well, it says it should be spaced 2.5 feet from the next one, but it's only this big. And so they'll put 6 of them in a pot. Your plants talk to each other. They have capabilities through their root system and through the mycorrhizal fungi to sense what's going on around them, and they will not grow properly. Plant spacing is a really common issue, especially if you're new to gardening. The instinct is to get as much into a space as possible. I get that. Don't do it, because your plants will not be healthy and happy, and it will decrease your production dramatically if your plants are too close together. And that's for almost every single plant, whether it's a watermelon or a pepper. Make sure that you have a good idea of plant spacing. I am really bad at eyeballing it, so I have a couple tools. I have a seed board that I bring out with me that tells you how to plant your seeds. If any of you have a seeder that you can use, those are awesome because you preset it and it'll plant the seeds exactly at the space that you want them to do. But you got to be careful with that. That's one of the other big things that will affect your garden. And then you'll be halfway into the season before you realize it. And then you've lost half that season of growth and you've stunted everything. So I think I'm going to end there. The next part is more insect and disease heavy. And I think it would be better and advantageous if we go out to the garden and we can kind of see what's going on there and kind of diagnose when we come back as far as the steps you go through if you have insect issues. Does anyone have any questions so far?
I have a lot of ants in my eggplant, the leaves growing. How to get rid of that?
Are they actually causing any, like...
No, they grow very healthy, have fruit, have flower and fruit, everything, but there's so many of them.
You know, ants don't typically bother me in the garden. They're pretty good. So she's saying she has ants that are heavy around her eggplants.
Yeah. Only on that plant.
Yeah, they've moved in. That's their piece of. They picked that address to go to. Yeah, I've only seen problems on occasion with ants where the infestation is so heavy, and this has been mostly with root vegetables that they're affecting the root vegetables' ability to thrive. Ants in general aren't gonna harm too much. It's one of those things. There's a lot of ways you can get rid of them.
I usually just water it down, but that's gonna kill the roots if I water it too much.
If you go out to your plant and assuming the plant has pretty good drainage and you just hold a hose on it for a couple minutes, oftentimes they'll pack up and leave. I had to move into one of my little dwarf fruit trees inside my house last year, and I didn't notice until I watered. But I even left, and I know I'm me, like I'm kind of weird, but I even left them and let them hibernate in there over the winter. They didn't really do much. But if they are becoming destructive, organic options, you can try using cornmeal. They'll eat it and it kills them. I don't know exactly how. There are pesticides you can put down. I'm hesitant to tell you to do that if it's not something that's not hurting anything.
Or something.
Is what?
The pyrethrin, what do you call it?
The pyrethrins?
Yeah.
It'll take care of them, but it's a pretty potent pesticide.
Well, just use it lightly, maybe.
Yeah. If they're really bothering you, you can.
I was just afraid it's gonna ruin my eggplant.
You should be okay.
Okay.
You should be okay. Oftentimes insects too, another good example is the roly-polies, right? The little pill bugs. They're usually not damaging to plants, but if they don't have enough organic matter to eat, they can become damaging to plants. They'll move on to your good plants. And we'll talk in the second part about integrated pest management, kind of how that plays in. But your first option is always do nothing, right? That's always a viable option. Right now I've got swallowtail caterpillars annihilating my fennel. It's cool, I like having them there. So there's an option to do nothing. But then you kind of work through, I would try just the hose method first of getting rid of them, because pyrethrins will kill other things that are in the vicinity too.
Okay.
Which may be okay.
That's why I haven't done anything. I just want to know what you say. What shall I do with that?
I sometimes wonder too if it's just because I'm lazy. It's like, I don't know, it's fine. It's probably fine.
Well, as long as it's not moving to other things, it's fine. It just stay in that plants.
Yeah, and that's the thing. Usually ants, they do move in, they set up shop, kind of like bees. They pick a space, and then they stay there for a while. So it's kind of, we have a baby rabbit that's eating one Swiss chard plant, and so it's the same thing.
Yeah.
It's like, fine, take the one plant, leave the rest of my stuff alone, and we'll come to an agreement.
I'm trying to do that too. Just take some and then leave the rest.
Yeah.
We've got a few sacrificial plants.
Usually a few plants do become sacrifices. Yeah. All right, Arnetta.
Okay, so
move on. Oh yes, I love this.
I just wanted to show you an example of a cedar that you can actually measure with, and then it has a depth control. I'm with Laura. I kind of eye things, so I don't really use these much, but I have them on hand, and I'm willing to lend them out. Okay, as long as I get them back. Okay. Bathroom. You'll need to go around to the back of the house and the back door there. The bathroom is, as soon as you go in, the bathroom is on the left. Okay.
Only gets to a certain size, but these guys will grow and grow and grow. And we've looked at, for those of you who have been in other classes, the world's largest tomato plant that fills an entire room. You can Google it, it's very cool. But so these guys will grow and grow and grow. There are lots of different methods for pruning. So if you go on YouTube, you'll find these people, they're like, no, don't do this, always do this. It's the only way you can do it. There's different methods that work okay. And especially if you're not doing commercial production, if you're just working in your own garden at home, my biggest thing is make sure you keep them manageable. because as you can see, some of these guys are huge and they will get bigger and bigger, and they can get 10 feet tall in a season, some varieties. So so don't be afraid to trim back enough that it makes it manageable. Second note too, we were just talking about this, you see there's some browning and some yellowing. Sometimes that can be a symptom of disease. Sometimes it can just be plant damage. You know, the plants all got through that windstorm the other day, but you can always prune those off. So the next thing you'll usually hear is to prune off the suckers. So what a sucker is, if you see here, there's 2 branches and there's one that grew right in between it. This would be one of the suckers. So if you look through a plant, and you all can just grab one too and start looking, those are what people are talking about. When I prune up my tomatoes, I usually look for any damage and prune that off. If I see disease on any of my plants, I'll sterilize my pruners before I move on to the next one, so I'm not just spreading the disease down the row. And then I'll look for some of these suckers that are growing in. Obviously, you don't want to cut off your flowering branches if you can help it, right? Those are the part that you want to keep. And that's also one of the reasons why it's so important to continue to prune your tomatoes, because once they get completely out of hand, you're going to be losing some flowers too if you're trying to just keep it manageable, okay? So I'll usually start kind of at the bottom, pick up my plant, and we can tie this guy, we'll restake, and I will start pruning off anything low. So I will trim all of this stuff up that isn't flowering, that's near the ground. The further you can keep the leaves up your plant, the less chance of splashing a disease up onto them when it rains or when you water. So if you prune those off and then look for the dead branches, anything dead comes off. Some of these are coming right off. You can pinch the little ones. And then I'll check for some of these that are taller. This one does have some flowers, so I don't want to cut here, right? But I can trim off these at the bottom here. Now, some people will say there's only, this is where people say, no, don't do too much, don't do too little. It needs to be 30% of the plant. It needs to be no more. It doesn't matter too much how much you take off, but like I said, you want to be sure you're leaving your flowers and therefore leaving enough foliage that you can provide photosynthesis to help the plant continue nourishing the fruit. But you do want to keep it manageable. And to me, this one, look how bushy it is right in here. So you probably want to trim some of that out. And then if you look too at the fruit, remember I was talking about the potential for sun scald. These guys are probably okay. When we get to some of these that are bushier though, see where the fruit is hanging out. If it's underneath there and it's ripening, you don't want to cut everything around it, okay? Otherwise you will potentially get sun scald, especially it's going to be hot the next couple days, right? So make sure if the fruit is in the shade, continue to give it some shade, okay? So if you guys want to go ahead and pick a plant.
Pick a plant.
Their own plant.
If there are little tomatoes on it and on your plant, then you can take them or eat them or however. Okay, and we do have other stakes and more twine. So let's get after it.
There's no chemicals on these tomatoes.
None.
Okay,
You need to sit down, baby. It's hot.
Banana to
sit down there.
Is the banana deal a hoax or to bring on more blooms?
So you'll hear bananas, you'll hear eggshells. It's not going to hurt anything, but guys, here's the thing, plants don't have mouths, right? If I hand this plant a banana right now, it can't eat it. If I put it under the soil, the roots can't eat it either. It has to wait until that banana peel or those eggshells are broken down into a component that the plant is able to absorb, and that could take years. So is it going to hurt your plant? Probably not. Could it help eventually? Maybe. But the bigger thing is your soil health, and it's not going to help immediately. You can't say, well, I don't want to use chemical fertilizer, so I'm just going to put, you know, a banana peel or something in. It won't work. Get some compost, you know, figure out what you need, get a soil test.
Okay, these ones that are heavy, we have some posts to stake them up so somebody could be on one side holding it, and while we restake, and we have some twine to get it back in place again. All of this is so that we can all learn how to do it.
Okay.
So everybody get after it.
I'll get on the other side. Do we need to stake?
Probably do. Some of these are sure heavy.
Be careful with the water line in the middle. It's underneath the plastic, but So if you need a steak, raise your hand and we'll get it to you.
This is way easier with a helper. It's way easier with a helper.
Yeah.